I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's May 27th, and we have a lot to talk about. And I want to start this week's conversation by reminding you that we're just 3 days away from World MS Day, a global event designed to raise awareness about MS while connecting people affected by MS around the world. World MS Day takes place on May 30th, and this year's theme is My Diagnosis. Every 5 minutes, someone somewhere in the world is diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. But getting that diagnosis can be challenging. It can often take too long, sometimes years, before an individual receives an accurate MS diagnosis. And by now, the evidence is clear that early intervention makes a real difference. The sooner someone can begin a disease-modifying therapy, the better their outcome is going to be. People living with MS literally can't afford to wait years before they begin treatment. So this year, World MS Day is focused on eliminating the obstacles that get in the way of a timely and accurate MS diagnosis. If you'd like to learn more about World MS Day or even participate in World MS Day, I'll invite you to visit worldmsday.org, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. I thought World MS Day would be the perfect time to invite Meredith O'Brien to join me on the podcast. Meredith's new book, Uncomfortably Numb 2, an anthology for newly diagnosed MS patients, highlights the journeys of several people who are living with MS, and also includes insights from Laura Hoke, the Associate Vice President for State Advocacy and Policy at the National MS Society, and Dr. Tanuja Chitnis, the Cindy Larson Chugg Distinguished Chair in Neurology at Brigham and Women's Hospital and a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. The book is a highly worthwhile read, and I hope you visit Amazon.com or your favorite bookseller and grab a copy. Meredith is also an MS activist. We actually met a couple of months ago in Washington, D.C. at the National MS Society's Public Policy Conference. While we're on the subject of public policy, it's with a high degree of sadness and disgust that I report that just last week, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a budget bill that, despite promises to the contrary, made drastic changes to Medicaid that will cut Medicaid spending by hundreds of millions of dollars, resulting in millions of Americans losing their health care coverage. As somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 people living with MS in the United States rely on Medicaid, this is a significant blow to the MS community. Worse yet, the budget bill also makes changes to the Affordable Care Act that will result in millions more Americans being left uninsured. Between changes to the ACA and changes to Medicaid, it's projected that about 13 million Americans will no longer have health insurance. The bill now moves on to the Senate, where we can only hope that senators will reject the portions of this 1,000-page bill that gut the health care programs that millions of American families rely on. This is a moment when each of you can step up and take action by contacting your senators and letting them know that we've had enough. Enough defunding vital MS research, enough closing of laboratories across the country and watching our scientific expertise get relocated to Europe, and enough of this inhumane attack on access to health care. None of these things make America healthier or great. What they do is help offset tax benefits for the richest Americans, and I think we've all had enough. Please visit nationalmssociety.org/advocacy today and see how easy it is to get involved and add your voice without even having to leave home. It's been well established that the Epstein-Barr virus, or EBV, must be present in an individual in order for MS to develop. Now, considering that somewhere between 90 and 95% of the world population carries the Epstein-Barr virus, scientists need to better understand what other factors must be present in addition to EBV in order for MS to develop. But knowing that the Epstein-Barr virus is a necessary factor in MS means that finding ways to mitigate the activity of this virus could lead to ways to prevent MS from developing. The specific biological mechanisms that link EBV and MS are still not well understood, and scientists are working hard to uncover those biological mechanisms. Last week, a research team in Germany published results of their study which shows that the Epstein-Barr virus is able to alter the movements of infected immune cells throughout the body. When EBV enters the body, it mainly infects B cells, and the researchers were able to show that EBV-infected B cells change their behavior and their movements. The research team was able to show that EBV-infected B cells move into other parts of the body, undergoing a process that enables them to actually squeeze out of blood vessels and move into the body's tissues. This process may enable these infected B cells to move into the brain, and because it's B cells in the brain that drive MS inflammation, this is the biological process that could potentially set the stage for MS to develop. This work creates an opportunity to develop therapies that prevent this B cell migration to the brain, which would then prevent MS. Through a proof-of-concept experiment with mice, the research team was able to demonstrate that stopping this process of B cell migration could stop EBV-infected B cells from getting into the brain. Now, as I often remind you, there's a huge difference between a mouse brain and a human brain. So further work is definitely needed here to determine whether this same process can be used safely in humans. But this brings us one more step closer to understanding how MS may develop, and armed with that insight, identify ways to stop MS before it has a chance to start. Now, if you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Today, Gilenya is the only disease-modifying therapy approved by the FDA for treating pediatric MS. And while other DMTs are sometimes prescribed off-label for kids and adolescents who are living with MS, there isn't much in the way of published data about how these other disease-modifying therapies actually impact pediatric MS. So a research team in Kuwait conducted a retrospective study of 24 pediatric-onset MS patients who had been treated with Ocrevus, a high-efficacy DMT that's been approved by the FDA and EMA for adults with MS. Following 15 months of treatment with Ocrevus, 91.7% of the study participants were relapse-free. Only one of the 24 patients showed MRI activity during the course of treatment. EDSS, the metric used to measure disability in someone with MS, was stabilized in 75% of the study participants, and EDSS actually improved in 16.7% of the study participants. About 92% of the study participants showed no evidence of disease activity, and none of the study participants experienced serious side effects. Hopefully, this study and others to come will give neurologists the freedom to prescribe the best therapy for their MS patient, regardless of how old or how young that patient may be. If you'd like to review the details of this encouraging study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. The term frailty is defined as a condition of being weak and delicate. Frailty is typically associated with aging, but research has shown that people with MS become frail earlier compared to the general population, and their frailty is associated with a lower quality of life, a greater incidence of falling, and more severe MS-related symptoms. Now, researchers in China are reporting that they have identified a specific molecule involved in inflammation that also seems to be associated with frailty among people with MS. This molecule is called interleukin-6, or IL-6, and it's what's known as a signaling molecule. Signaling molecules are chemical messengers that play an important role in transmitting information between cells. The The researchers also noted that other molecules from the same category of inflammatory signaling proteins, molecules called cytokines, were also found to be present at higher levels in individuals with relapsing remitting MS who were frail compared to individuals who weren't. So chronic inflammation may not only trigger MS symptoms, but as this research team pointed out, it may also be responsible for frailty among people with MS. If you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. And whether it's frailty, balance, mobility challenges, or any number of invisible symptoms, learning to live with MS is a process. My guest, Meredith O'Brien's new book, Uncomfortably Numb 2, an anthology for newly diagnosed MS patients, makes that process a little easier for those who are recently diagnosed by sharing individual MS journeys along with expert opinion and advice. In a moment, we'll meet my guest, Meredith O'Brien. Meredith O'Brien is a former newspaper reporter and investigative journalist. She's the author of several books, and her latest is entitled Uncomfortably Numb 2, an anthology for newly diagnosed MS patients. The book highlights the journeys of several people who were living with MS and also includes insights from Laura Hoke, the Associate Vice President for State Advocacy and Policy at the National MS Society, and Dr. Tanuja Chitnis, the Cindy Larson Chugg Distinguished Chair of Neurology at Brigham and Women's Hospital and a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. Meredith is also an MS activist. In fact, Meredith and I met just a couple of months ago at the National MS Society's Public Policy Conference. Welcome to the podcast, Meredith.
Well, thank you, John. I'm really glad to be here.
As I mentioned a moment ago, your new book is titled Uncomfortably Numb 2, an anthology for newly diagnosed MS patients, and it's a follow-up to your memoir, which was entitled Uncomfortably Numb. So what made you circle back and write a part 2 to Uncomfortably Numb?
Well, it's funny. My publisher, Nancy Cleary from Wyatt Mackenzie, she contacted me last year and she said, "Do you want to write a sequel?" And I said, "Well, I haven't really lived enough to have enough material for a memoir." And she said, No. How about an anthology collection of people's stories?" And I said, "That's a brilliant idea because I have never read a collection of people whose MS in one book whose MS journeys are so different." And when I wrote my memoir, I could only represent myself. And I was glad to be able to help share the stories of different people who have a variety of experiences.
Well, one of the things I noticed is that the people that you do highlight in the book, they have different MS journeys, but also within those journeys, some very common experience that I think anyone living with MS would recognize from, sometimes taking years to get an accurate diagnosis, to choosing whether or not to share that diagnosis with others, to fighting with insurance companies for approvals for medications. By its title, this book is aimed at people who have been recently diagnosed. Are you sort of letting them know what to expect?
Well, I'm trying to give them a reasonable perspective on a variety of experiences. And I know when I was first diagnosed in 2014, I went online. I was reading all of these different things. I would have really appreciated a book that gave me perspectives from the front lines, what people really expected, and the successes and the challenges that people faced, I think would have been beneficial to me as a newly diagnosed patient.
I think you're absolutely right about that. Speaking of things like sharing your MS diagnosis, you yourself hesitated in sharing your diagnosis. Tell me what that was like for you.
When I was diagnosed, I was teaching part-time at a university. I still teach part-time at two different universities. And I didn't tell them that I had MS until my memoir was coming out because I figured, I should let them know before the book is on the shelves. So I was afraid that I get hired on a semester to semester basis. I was afraid they'd say, she's not a good gamble. There's a lot of misinformation about MS, and people don't understand what that journey can look like. So I was afraid it was going to affect my professional career. And I told them. And then after that, I was able to, I was much more open about it, and I asked for accommodations, and I realized I was afraid for no reason, at least in my experience. Other patients may have different reasons for not coming forward or not wanting to tell people or their employers about their MS. But for me, it was helpful. It really, it enabled me to get conditions that were better suited for my MS symptoms.
I happen to know some of the people who were featured in the book. And you know, what I saw in going through their stories is it's not simply recounting the facts or the events that they may have experienced. You really allow the story of the emotional side of their MS journey to come through. Why was that important for you to include?
Because I think we feel isolated, or that our worry or our concerns are just ours. It's just my experience. Like, I spoke with one MS activist and patient named Noelle Connolly, who was diagnosed as a teenager. And she went through so much to try to get diagnosed, and was concerned about how this was going to affect the rest of her life and her fears about her future. And now she's able to reflect back on what her experiences were then versus now. And I asked every contributor, what would you advise a newly diagnosed person on each of the topics that we talk about in the book? What would your advice be, so that hopefully people can benefit from an array of people's experiences and things that I wish I'd done differently and other people had done differently?
So I guess I'll turn that question around to you. What would you advise a newly diagnosed person?
I think that they really need to assess where they need to be able to emotionally process what's happening and what has happened, and recognize that life's going to be different. It doesn't mean it's going to be horrible. It just means it's going to be different. And I took a long time to accept that. I was kind of fighting I thought I could fight my MS diagnosis, that I could just push through it. And I'm like, no, it just made me frustrated and stressed. And I had to recognize my life was going to look different, and to say, that's okay. What can I do? And one of the themes that come up frequently in the book, a lot of people say, they focused on what they can do, how they can still travel, how they can do things differently. A couple of the interviewees talked about going out in public, going to, say, a baseball game, and they have mobility issues, and they still wanted to do that. So they talk about how they were able to do that. Or people who travel internationally on airplanes, how could they do that with their mobility devices? So I think that you can see a way through, you can see a way to get to a new version of your life.
You know, when I introduced you a moment ago, I reminded our listeners that you're an MS activist. What's important about advocacy for you? I
felt initially disempowered when I got my diagnosis. And then I went through my own emotional journey to get to where I am, which I would describe as kind of an uneasy piece with what my health status is. But it took me years before I decided to get involved with my local MS Society chapter. And I have always been interested in news and politics. And I found out that they advocate for MS patients and those with chronic illnesses on the state level with my state legislature, as well as on the national level with our members of Congress. And I'd never done anything like that before in my life. I'd written about it. And to be able to, I was trained and I was given the confidence to be able to go and speak to my state legislators about issues that are important. I got to sit down with my member of Congress and talk about the MS experience and why certain bills or policies would benefit people with MS and those with chronic illnesses. And it made you feel like I'm doing something. I am helping others beyond my own experience. And it was empowering, I thought.
I couldn't agree more. My listeners will tell you I've believed in the importance and the power of advocacy for a very long time. But I happen to think that 2025 is the year for every individual living with MS or any chronic health condition to become an activist. We're seeing some scary stuff taking place at the federal level in the United States. What's your take on what we're seeing, and what can people living with MS do about it?
You're absolutely right. The atmosphere right now is very uncertain, and it's a lot of the policies for the chronic illness community and for MS specifically are frightening. A lot of MS research has just been flatlined in the current budget, federal budget, and future budgets. And other folks who rely on Medicaid to help with their MS costs, because MS, as we all know, I'm sure your listeners all know, costs immense. It costs an immense amount of resources and funds and energy just to get the medicine you need, the therapies you need. And it is an uncertain, and to see all of that become jeopardized is unnerving. But I learned this year, this was the first time I went to Washington, D.C. for the National Public Policy Conference for the MS Society. And I'd never been in a room with so many people who all had MS or connections to MS. And it was, even though the news outside the walls was kind of frightening, I felt like a team. We were together as a team. And this year in particular was the first time outside of my work with the MS Society, I've called up members of Congress. I've written emails. I've become a pest. And I said, you know what? This isn't that hard to do, to call your members of Congress, to write letters, to write postcards. And I'd kind of been afraid to do that. But if not now, in this moment of high impact for the MS community, when? If people haven't done it yet, it's really easy once you get over that hump of who am I? Who am I to say anything to an elected official? Well, you have a story. You represent people whose stories you're telling, and all together our voices can be very loud.
Well, I hope everyone who just heard what you had to say visits nationalmssociety.org/advocacy and signs up to become an MS activist. While we're talking about advocacy, sometimes a person's MS journey is impacted simply because of where in the world they happen to live. As is pointed out in your book, when MS is diagnosed early, an individual can start a disease-modifying therapy that's going to slow disease progression. It's going to preserve a higher quality of life for them. Well, unfortunately, the MS International Federation tells us that 83% of the countries worldwide experience issues that prevent people from getting an early MS diagnosis. May 30th is World MS Day. And this year, MS activists around the world are raising awareness that getting the right diagnosis can be life-changing, and they're making a global call for early, accurate MS diagnosis. I think it fits perfectly with some of the patient journeys and expert medical opinion that you happen to share in your book.
Yeah, I agree. And if an early diagnosis is not only great or better for the patients, but financially in the long run, if you can give people the services and the Medicaid disease-modifying therapies that they need to try to forestall the advancement of the disease, it will benefit everyone, not just the patient and the patient's families.
The book is Uncomfortably Numb 2, an anthology for newly diagnosed MS patients. The author is Meredith O'Brien. Meredith, I want to thank you for helping newly diagnosed patients better understand what living with MS might be like for them. Thank you for your advocacy efforts, and thanks so much for talking with me today.
Well, thank you for this forum, this podcast, and to give people to give people a place to talk about these issues.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/404. You'll find that link in today's show notes so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes, and it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. From the Consortium of MS Centers annual meeting in Phoenix, Arizona, I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.